Phocion was 8 years old when the soldiers came. His city had backed the wrong side in one of Greece's endless wars, and the price was always the same. The men were slaughtered, the women taken, and the children sold. He still remembered his mother's scream when they ripped him from her arms. He never saw her again. The slave market in Athens smelled like urine and fear. Merchants examined children like livestock, checking teeth, looking for deformities, testing strength. Phocion was small but healthy, with intelligent eyes that caught the attention of a wealthy Athenian named Callias. The man needed a pedagogue, a slave educated enough to teach his sons but broken enough never to challenge them. Callias paid 30 drachmas, a decent price for a child who could already read. The family seemed normal at first. Wealthy, educated, connected to Athens's philosophical circles. Callias owned a beautiful home near the Agora, with a small library and a courtyard where his 2 sons played. Phocion's duties were simple. Teach the boys grammar, mathematics, basic philosophy, and accompany them everywhere as their guardian and servant. But 3 days after his purchase, Callias took him to a back room where a physician waited. 2 household slaves held Phocion down while the doctor worked. They cut the tendons in both his feet, slicing through the tissue with practiced efficiency. The pain was beyond anything the child had experienced. He screamed until his voice gave out. When it was over, Callias knelt beside him. "You'll heal in a few weeks. You'll be able to walk after a fashion. But you'll never run. You'll never escape. And every step you take for the rest of your life will remind you that you belong to me." The logic was simple and brutal. Pedagogues were educated slaves, often more intelligent than their masters' children. They knew their own worth. Some ran away, trying to reach cities where they might pass as free men. The Athenians had learned to eliminate that possibility. A crippled slave was a loyal slave. Phocion spent 2 months learning to walk again, his feet twisted inward, the tendons too short to extend properly. He lurched and dragged, his gait awkward and painful. The household slaves called him Crooked Foot when the masters weren't listening. The ones who pitied him stopped making eye contact. When he finally began teaching Callias's sons, Phocion discovered he was far better educated than the boys would ever be. His own city had valued learning. He knew poetry that Athenian children had never heard, mathematical concepts their tutors couldn't grasp. He could recite passages from Homer that made the boys' recitations sound like children babbling. This made everything worse. The oldest son, Nicias, was 12 and stupid. He struggled with basic grammar and resented being corrected by a crippled slave. During lessons, he would accidentally step on Phocion's twisted feet, grinding down until the slave gasped in pain. When Phocion tried to continue the lesson, Nicias would laugh and do it again. Callias watched these incidents with approval. "You're learning authority," he told his son. "A man who can't control his slaves will never control anything." The younger son, Alexios, was worse. He was 9, clever and naturally cruel. He asked questions during lessons not to learn, but to trap Phocion into saying something that could be twisted into disrespect. When the slave explained a mathematical concept, Alexios would pretend not to understand, forcing Phocion to repeat himself over and over until his voice was hoarse and his patience gone. Then Alexios would smile. "Father, the slave is getting frustrated with me. He thinks I'm stupid." Callias would summon Phocion to the courtyard, where household slaves were punished. The whip was standard. 10 lashes for disrespecting the young master, delivered while the boys watched. Phocion learned to take the beating in silence. Screaming only made Alexios smile wider. But wait, it gets worse. The boys were required to study philosophy as part of their education. They read Socrates, discussed virtue and justice, memorized passages about the ideal society. During these lessons, Phocion had to stand behind them, ready to fetch scrolls or clarify difficult passages. One afternoon, they were studying a dialogue about natural slaves versus natural free men. Socrates argued that some people were born to be ruled, lacking the intelligence and virtue necessary for freedom. Nicias looked up from the scroll and pointed at Phocion. "Is he a natural slave, father?" Callias considered the question seriously. An interesting case. He's intelligent enough to teach you, which suggests some capacity for reason. But look at him. The gods marked him with deformity. His own people lost their war, which proves their weakness. And he was born in a barbarian city, not Athens. So yes, he's naturally suited to slavery. His mind is sharp enough to serve, but not to rule himself. Phocion stood there, listening to them debate whether his enslavement was justified by nature or merely by force. The boy he was teaching, who couldn't multiply fractions or spell correctly, was explaining why Phocion deserved to be a slave. The man who'd deliberately crippled him was calling it the will of the gods. The lesson continued. They discussed virtue, wisdom, and the examined life. All the while, Phocion's butchered feet throbbed with pain he'd learned to ignore, and his back bore fresh whip marks from that morning's discipline. This was Athens. This was the glory of Greece. Philosophers debating freedom in rooms guarded by mutilated slaves. But Alexios wasn't finished with him yet. The boys called him Crooked Foot openly now, even in front of guests. Phocion had learned not to respond. Slaves who showed emotion were slaves who got beaten. He kept his face neutral, his voice steady, his eyes downcast. He became a teaching machine, a crippled repository of knowledge that existed only to serve. But Alexios had developed a hobby, and Phocion was the subject. It started small. During lessons, Alexios would accidentally spill his wine on Phocion's tunic. The slave would have to continue teaching while soaked, the sticky liquid attracting flies. When Phocion tried to clean himself, Alexios would complain that the slave was interrupting the lesson. More whipping. Then Alexios discovered fire. The family kept oil lamps burning throughout the house. During one mathematics lesson, Alexios held a small iron stylus in the lamp flame until it glowed red. Then, while Phocion was explaining a geometry problem, the boy pressed the hot metal against the slave's arm. Phocion jerked away, unable to stop himself. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Alexios laughed. "Continue the lesson, Crooked Foot. Don't let a little heat distract you." Phocion's arm blistered immediately. He forced himself to return to the problem, his voice shaking slightly as he explained the properties of triangles. The burn throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Alexios watched with fascination, studying the slave's face for any sign of breaking. When the lesson ended, Phocion limped to the kitchen, where an older female slave named Thera helped him treat the wound. She was Egyptian, captured decades ago, her body covered in scars from a lifetime of service. "The young master is practicing," she said quietly, applying a poultice to the burn. "I've seen this before. The cruel ones always start with small tortures. They want to see how far they can go before you break." "What happens when I break?" Thera didn't answer. Her silence was answer enough. The burns became routine. Alexios would heat his stylus during every lesson now, sometimes pressing it to Phocion's arms, sometimes his legs, once to his neck. The boy was careful never to burn the slave's face or hands, nothing that would interfere with his teaching duties. This was calculated cruelty, torture refined to maximize suffering while preserving function. Callias knew. Of course he knew. He watched one of these sessions from the doorway, arms crossed, nodding with approval. When Phocion finally looked at him, silently begging for intervention, Callias smiled. "My son is learning about authority and control. These are essential skills for an Athenian citizen. You should be proud to contribute to his education." After that, Alexios burned him in front of his father, making it part of the lesson. The boy would recite philosophical passages about virtue and self-control while heating the stylus. Then he'd apply it to Phocion's skin and watch the slave's face, studying the effort it took to remain composed. "Socrates says the wise man masters his passions," Alexios would say, pressing the hot metal deeper. "Are you a wise man, Crooked Foot?" "No, master," Phocion would whisper. "I'm a slave." "Good. Then you have nothing to master. You're not really a man at all." The household slaves began avoiding Phocion. His suffering was contagious. a reminder of what any of them could become if the masters decided to make them a project. Only Thera still helped him, treating his burns in silence, her old hands gentle. One evening, while she cleaned a particularly bad burn on his shoulder, Phocion broke down. Not crying, not screaming, just a quiet collapse of whatever had been holding him together. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I can't keep teaching them. I can't keep pretending this is normal." Thera gripped his arm hard enough to hurt. "Listen to me. You survive by being valuable. The moment you stop teaching well, the moment you become useless, they'll sell you to the mines. Do you understand? The silver mines at Lorient, where slaves last 6 months if they're lucky. That's where broken pedagogues go." Phocion knew about the mines. Every slave in Athens knew. The Athenian democracy, the philosophical paradise, the cradle of Western civilization, ran on silver extracted by slaves worked to death in underground tunnels. Men who entered those mines never saw daylight again. They died in darkness, lungs destroyed by rock dust, backs broken by constant labor, bodies discarded in mass graves no one bothered to mark. That was his alternative. Teach the boys who tortured him, or die screaming in a hole. "I understand," he said, "but wait, it gets worse." One afternoon, during a rare break between lessons, Phocion was resting in the slaves' quarters when he saw her. Her name was Milena, a Thracian girl captured the same year as Phocion. She worked in the kitchens, another invisible servant in Callias's household. She had dark hair, sad eyes, and scars on her wrists from the slave manacles. They'd never spoken. Slaves didn't fraternize unnecessarily. It only led to complications. But that day, she looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition. Two people who'd been torn from their homes and broken by the same system. They began meeting in secret. Just talking at first, in whispered conversations during the brief moments when they weren't being watched. She told him about her village, her family, the songs her mother used to sing. He told her about his city, his education, his memories of a life before Athens. These conversations became Phocion's only source of joy. For a few stolen moments each day, he wasn't Crooked Foot, the crippled pedagogue. He was just Phocion, talking to someone who saw him as human. They were careful. They never met in the same place twice. They developed signals to warn each other when masters were near. For months, their secret held. Then Milena got pregnant. She told him one evening, her face pale with terror. They both knew what this meant. Pregnant slaves were problems. If Callias was feeling generous, he might let her carry to term and sell the child. If he wasn't, he'd force her to abort, usually through beatings or poisons that frequently killed the mother, too. "We have to tell him it's yours," Milena whispered. "Maybe he'll let us stay together. Maybe he'll let us keep the child." Phocion knew better. He'd seen what happened to slaves who tried to form families. Callias didn't permit it. Attachments made slaves less controllable, gave them reasons to run or rebel. But Milena was desperate, her hands gripping his, and he couldn't bring himself to destroy her hope. They told Callias the next morning. The master listened in silence, his face unreadable. Then he laughed. Not angry laughter, but genuine amusement, as if they'd told him an excellent joke. "You thought I'd let you keep it? You thought I'd let my slaves breed like animals and create more problems for me?" He called for his overseer, a brutal Scythian who handled the household's dirty work. "Take the girl to the market. Sell her to the lowest bidder. Make sure they know she's pregnant. That'll knock the price down. I want her gone by sunset." Milena screamed. Phocion dropped to his knees, begging, his twisted feet folding under him in a way that sent lightning bolts of pain up his legs. He offered everything he had, which was nothing. He promised better teaching, perfect obedience, anything. Callias watched him grovel with the same expression he wore when watching his son burn the slave during lessons. Clinical interest. "This is educational for you," he said. "You're learning that slaves don't love. Slaves don't make families. Slaves serve. That's all you are. That's all you'll ever be." They dragged Milena away. Phocion tried to follow, crawling when his feet wouldn't support him. The overseer kicked him in the ribs hard enough to crack something. He lay there, listening to her screams fade as they took her to the market, sold her to whoever would buy a pregnant slave. She was gone within hours. Callias made Phocion teach that evening, business as usual, as if nothing had happened. Alexios burned him twice during the lesson. Phocion barely felt it. He was already destroyed. Years would pass before he learned what happened to her. Sold to a brothel that specialized in pregnant women, a specific perversion for wealthy clients. She died in childbirth. The baby, a boy, was sold immediately. Phocion would never know his son's name. 10 years passed. Phocion was 28 now, his body a catalogue of scars and deformities. The burns from Alexios had left patches of discolored, leathery skin across his arms and legs. His feet had worsened with age, the twisted tendons causing constant pain that radiated up through his knees and hips. Walking was agony. Standing for hours during lessons was torture, but he was still valuable. Nikeas and Alexios had grown into men, educated enough to function in Athenian society, though neither possessed any real intelligence. They'd moved out of their father's house, establishing their own households. Callias had acquired new sons through remarriage, younger boys who needed education. The cycle continued. New masters to teach, new cruelties to endure. But something had changed in the household. Callias was older now, less attentive to the daily operations of his estate. The overseer had died, replaced by a younger, lazier man who spent most of his time drunk. The discipline that had once governed every moment of slave life had loosened, just slightly. That's when Phocion met Zoe. She'd been purchased 6 months earlier, a Macedonian woman in her mid-20s. She worked in the weaving rooms, producing the cloth that wealthy Athenian women used for their clothing. Like Phocion, she'd been mutilated to prevent escape. The slavers had cut the tendons in her left hand, leaving it partially crippled, the fingers curled into a permanent claw. They first spoke in the courtyard, late at night, when the household slept. She'd been crying, trying to muffle the sound. Phocion had been there because sleeping was difficult with the pain in his feet. He'd learned that walking at night sometimes helped, though it left him exhausted for the next day's teaching. "I'm sorry," she said when she saw him. "I didn't mean to disturb anyone." "You didn't disturb me." He sat beside her, his twisted feet stretched out in front of him. "I can't sleep either." They talked. Just small things at first. The weather, the work, the other slaves. But over weeks, those conversations deepened. She told him about her capture, how Macedonian raiders had sold her people to Greek slavers. He told her about his city, his education, the life that had been stolen from him as a child. Zoe understood him in a way no one else could. She'd also been educated before her capture, the daughter of a craftsman who taught her to read and calculate. In another life, another world, they might have been equals. Instead, they were broken things, piecing together moments of humanity in the gaps between their suffering. They began meeting regularly, always careful, always watching for the household guards. The new overseer was drunk most nights, but there were other slaves who might report them, hoping to gain favor with the masters. "Why do you teach them?" Zoe asked one night. "After everything they've done to you, how do you stand there and educate those boys?" Phocion had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. "Because if I stop being useful, I die. That's the only answer that matters. There has to be more than survival." "Does there?" He looked at his ruined feet, the burn scars, the marks of 2 decades of abuse. "I used to think so. I used to believe that intelligence meant something, that knowledge had value beyond service. But the Greeks taught me differently. They taught me that I'm a tool, a broken, crippled tool, but still functional enough to use." Zoe took his hand, her crippled hand, with its clawed fingers, gripping his scarred one. "You're not a tool. You're a man who's been treated like a tool. There's a difference." For the first time in years, Phocion felt something other than pain and emptiness. Hope, maybe, or just the memory of what hope had felt like. They fell in love. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was two drowning people grabbing onto each other, knowing they'd probably both sink, but unable to let go. They were careful. More careful than Phocion had been with Milena. They never touched during the day, never looked at each other when masters were present, never gave any indication that they were more than two slaves who occasionally crossed paths. For 8 months, their secret held. Zoe got pregnant. She told him in the courtyard, the same place they'd first talked. Her face was pale, her crippled hand trembling. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I tried to prevent it. I used every method the other women told me about. But nothing worked." Phocion felt his world collapsing again. He'd sworn after Milena that he'd never let himself care about anyone again. But he'd broken that promise, and now he'd pay the price. They both would. "We won't tell them," he said. "We'll hide it as long as possible. Maybe." "Maybe what?" Zoe's voice cracked. "You know what happens to pregnant slaves. You know better than anyone." She was right. He did know. But wait, it gets worse. They managed to hide the pregnancy for 3 months. Zoe wore loose clothing, and the other female slaves, who'd grown to like her, helped conceal her condition. But eventually, the household steward noticed. He reported directly to Calais. The master summoned them both to the courtyard. The old man was in his 60s now, his hair white, his face lined with age. But his eyes were still sharp, still cruel. "Did you learn nothing from the last time?" Calais asked Phocion. "I thought I taught you that slaves don't breed. Apparently, you need another lesson." He turned to his guards. "Take the woman to the market. I want her sold today. Find the worst buyer you can. Brothels, mines, I don't care. Just get her out of my house." Phocion didn't beg this time. He knew it wouldn't help. He just stood there, his weight on his ruined feet, watching as they dragged Zoe away. She didn't scream like Milena had. She just looked at him, her eyes full of everything they'd never be able to say to each other. Calais watched her go, then turned back to Phocion. "Back to work. The boys need their lessons." But Phocion couldn't move. Something inside him had finally broken. Some last piece of humanity that had survived 2 decades of abuse. He stood there, staring at nothing, while Calais grew impatient. "I said back to work." "No." The word came out quietly, but it echoed in the courtyard like a shout. Slaves didn't say no. Slaves didn't refuse orders. The household guards moved toward him immediately, but Calais held up his hand. "What did you say?" "I said no." Phocion looked at his master, really looked at him, without the downcast eyes or careful deference that had kept him alive. "I won't teach your children anymore. I won't stand in your house and pretend this is normal. I'm done." Calais smiled. It was the same smile he'd worn when watching Alexios burn the slave during lessons, the same expression of clinical interest. "You think refusing will help her? She's already sold. She's probably already in chains, on her way to whatever hell I sent her to. Your defiance accomplishes nothing except your own destruction." "I know. The mines, then. I'll sell you to Lorien. You'll die in the dark, coughing up rock dust, your back broken by labor. That's what you're choosing. Better than this." Calais studied him for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "As you wish. Guards, take him to the market. I want him sold to the mining contractors by tomorrow." They dragged Phocion away. He didn't resist. There was no point. He'd made his choice, knowing it was suicide, but no longer able to pretend he was anything other than a man being slowly murdered by his masters. That night, locked in a holding cell at the market, Phocion learned what happened to Zoe. One of the guards, drunk and talkative, told him the details. She'd been sold to a brothel that specialized in pregnant women. Certain clients paid premium prices for that particular depravity. The brothel was in Piraeus, Athens's port district, a place where anything could be bought if you had enough money. But Zoe never worked there. She'd killed herself the first night, using a piece of broken pottery to open the veins in her working arm. She'd bled out in a locked room, choosing death over what awaited her. The baby died with her. The guard thought this was hilarious. Stupid bitch wasted herself before they could even use her. The brothel owner was furious. He'd paid good money for a pregnant slave. Phocion sat in the darkness, listening to the guard laugh, and felt absolutely nothing. He was empty, hollowed out. A shell that used to contain a person. But wait, it gets worse. The next morning, before they could transport him to the mines, there was a complication. A visitor came to the market, asking specifically for the pedagogue being sold by Callias. It was Alexios. Alexios had grown into a handsome man, tall, well-built, with the confidence that came from a lifetime of privilege and cruelty. At 22, he'd already established himself in Athenian politics, serving on minor councils, making connections, building the foundation of a career. He stood in front of Phocion's cell, looking at the broken slave who'd taught him mathematics and philosophy. "You look terrible," Alexios said. "My father told me what happened. Your little rebellion. Very dramatic, very pointless." Phocion didn't respond. He had nothing left to say. "The mines would kill you in a month," Alexios continued. "You're too old, too damaged. It would be a waste. So I've made my father an offer. I'll buy you from him, take you off his hands. You'll come work in my household instead." "Why?" "Because you're useful." Alexios smiled, the same smile he'd worn as a child, right before pressing hot iron to Phocion's skin. "I'm moving up in politics. I need someone to write my speeches, help me prepare for debates, handle correspondence. Someone educated. Someone who knows how the philosophical arguments work. Someone who can make me sound intelligent." Phocion understood immediately. Alexios wanted to use his mind the same way he'd once used his body as a torture practice. A different kind of slavery, but slavery nonetheless. "And if I refuse?" "Then you go to the mines. You die screaming in the dark, lungs destroyed, body broken. Or you come with me, use your mind for a few more years, and maybe die in a bed instead of a hole. Your choice." It wasn't a choice. It was just another level of hell. Alexios purchased him that afternoon. The price was higher than expected because pedagogues, even damaged ones, retained value. Callias made a small profit on the deal, which seemed to please him more than the slave's suffering ever had. They took Phocion to Alexios' house, a modest but comfortable home in a good district. The household was small, just a few slaves and servants. Alexios wasn't wealthy yet, but he was ambitious, and that ambition needed feeding. "Your job is simple," Alexios explained, showing Phocion to a small room in the basement. "I have a speech to give next week at the assembly. You'll write it. I'll tell you the topic, the arguments I want to make, and you'll craft something that sounds impressive. Then you'll help me memorize it, practice delivery, anticipate counter-arguments. Understand?" "I understand." "Good. And Phocion, don't even think about sabotaging me. If my speech fails, if I'm embarrassed in front of the assembly, I'll have you flayed alive and left in the agora for dogs to eat. Clear?" "Clear." Alexios left him alone in the basement room. It was small, dark, with a thin sleeping mat and a desk with writing materials. This would be Phocion's world now, a cell where he'd craft words to glorify the system that had destroyed him. The first speech was about property rights, specifically about strengthening protections for slave owners against slaves who damaged or destroyed their master's property. Alexios wanted to propose harsher penalties, public floggings and executions to deter slave rebellion. Phocion sat at the desk, staring at the blank wax tablet, and felt his soul dying by inches. He wrote the speech. He made it eloquent, persuasive, full of philosophical arguments borrowed from Aristotle and Plato about natural slavery and the necessity of hierarchy. He crafted phrases that would make the assembly nod in agreement, that would advance Alexios's political career while tightening the chains on thousands of slaves. When he finished, He felt sick. Alexios loved it. He practiced the speech for hours, Phocion correcting his pronunciation, helping him with hand gestures and rhetorical emphasis. The master became animated, excited, seeing his political future opening before him. "This is brilliant," Alexios said. "You've made me sound like a philosopher, like a statesman. This will get me noticed." The speech was delivered the following week. It was a success. The assembly applauded. Several prominent citizens congratulated Alexios afterward, and the proposals passed with minor modifications. Athens would now execute slaves who destroyed property worth more than a certain value, and masters could collect compensation from the state if their slaves were killed during failed escape attempts. Phocion had just made slavery more brutal, more violent, more profitable for masters. Alexios celebrated with a feast. Phocion was kept in the basement, listening to the laughter and music from above. The commissions kept coming. More speeches, letters to political allies, arguments for legal cases. Alexios's career flourished, and Phocion was the invisible engine driving it forward. Every success his master achieved was built on words Phocion had written, ideas Phocion had articulated, philosophy Phocion had learned before his capture. But wait, it gets worse. 3 years into this arrangement, Alexios was appointed to a committee reviewing Athens' slave laws. The city-state was experiencing labor shortages in the silver mines, and the government wanted to expand the pool of available slaves. Someone proposed eliminating certain protections for pedagogues and household slaves, making it easier to transfer them to manual labor when needed. Alexios asked Phocion to research the proposal and write a recommendation. "I need you to make the case for eliminating protections," Alexios said. "Argue that educated slaves are still slaves, that their value shouldn't shield them from serving wherever Athens needs them. Make it sound philosophical. Make it sound just." Phocion stared at the documents. Alexios was asking him to write his own death warrant, to craft the arguments that would send pedagogues like himself to the mines when their masters tired of them. "I can't write this." Alexios leaned back in his chair, studying the slave. "You can't, or you won't. Both. You remember our agreement. You write what I tell you to write, or you suffer. Those were the terms. Then I'll suffer." Alexios stood up, walked to the door, and called for his guards. They came immediately, 2 large Scythians who served as his personal enforcers. "Take him to the room," Alexios ordered. They dragged Phocion to a storage area in the basement, a space used for wine and oil jars. They stripped him, chained his wrists to a beam, and left him hanging. His ruined feet barely touched the ground, all his weight on his shoulders and wrists. Alexios returned with a whip. Not the standard punishment whip, but something worse. Barbed leather, designed to tear flesh rather than just bruise it. "You taught me philosophy," Alexios said, examining the whip. "You taught me about Socrates, about virtue and wisdom. Do you remember what Socrates said about obedience? That the wise man obeys those who rule over him. That questioning authority is the mark of a fool." He swung the whip. The barbs caught Phocian's back, tearing skin and muscle. The pain was extraordinary, beyond the burns from childhood, beyond the beatings from Callias. This was designed to destroy. "I'm going to whip you every day until you write what I want," Alexios said, swinging again. "And if you die before you finish, I'll find another pedagogue. They're not as educated as you, but they'll be more obedient." The whipping continued for an hour. When it was over, Phocian's back was a landscape of torn flesh, exposed muscle, and pooling blood. They left him hanging there overnight, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything except the pain. The next morning, they brought him down and dragged him back to his desk. Writing materials were placed in front of him. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the stylus. "Write," Alexios ordered, "or we do this again." Phocion wrote. His hands trembled, blood from his back dripping onto the wax tablet, but he wrote. He crafted the arguments that would eliminate protections for educated slaves, that would make it easier to send pedagogues to the mines, that would ensure his own eventual destruction. The words he wrote were poison. They were death. They were everything he'd fought against for decades. but he wrote them anyway because he was broken, and broken things do what they're told. Alexios submitted the recommendation to the committee. It was accepted with unanimous approval. Within months, Athens passed new laws making educated slaves as disposable as manual laborers, eliminating the protections that had kept pedagogues out of the mines. Phocion had destroyed his own kind to buy himself a few more months of life, and Alexios's political career soared higher. 5 more years passed. Phocion was 38 years old, though he looked 60. His body had become a monument to suffering. The scars on his back from Alexios's whipping had never healed properly, leaving thick ridges of scar tissue that cracked and bled when he moved. His twisted feet had deteriorated further, the bones grinding against each other with every step. Arthritis had seized his hands, making writing an exercise in constant pain. But he kept writing. Speech after speech, law after law. Every word designed to glorify Athens and strengthen the chains on its slaves. Alexios was a rising star now. At 27, he'd been appointed to several prestigious councils, served as a junior magistrate, and was being groomed for higher office. His speeches were quoted, his legal opinions respected. People spoke of him as a future leader of Athens, a philosopher-statesman in the tradition of Pericles. Every word of praise was built on Phocion's broken back. The household had grown. Alexios had married well, taking a wife from a prominent family. They had 2 young sons who would eventually need education, more children to teach, more masters to serve. The cycle would continue until Phocion died at his desk, or was finally sent to the mines. But something had changed in Phocion. The breaking that had begun with Zoe's death had continued, slowly hollowing him out until there was nothing left but a shell that performed its functions. He no longer felt anger or grief, or even pain in any meaningful way. He was automated, mechanical, a writing machine that produced words without thought or emotion, except at night. At night, alone in his basement room, Phocion began to write again. Not speeches or legal arguments, but something else. Something true. He was documenting everything, every cruelty, every injustice, every horror he'd witnessed and endured in 30 years of slavery. He wrote in his native language, not Greek, using a script that no Athenian could read. He carved the words into wax tablets, then copied them onto stolen scraps of papyrus that he hid in the walls of his room. He had no plan for these documents, no hope that anyone would ever read them. He just needed to record the truth, to create some evidence that his suffering had been real, that the glory of Athens was built on mountains of broken bodies and destroyed lives. It was a pointless act of defiance, a silent scream into the void. He wrote about his capture as a child, the slave market, the mutilation of his feet. He documented Callias's household in detail, naming names, describing tortures. He wrote about Milena and Zoe, about the children he'd never known, about the decades of teaching boys who burned and beat him while learning about virtue and justice. He wrote about the speeches he'd crafted for Alexios, the laws he'd helped pass, the ways he'd been forced to strengthen the very system destroying him. He wrote about pedagogue after pedagogue being sent to the mines under the new laws, dying in darkness because of arguments he'd written. The writing became his only act of resistance, his only way of asserting that he was still human, still capable of bearing witness to his own destruction. He worked on these documents for 2 years, stealing moments whenever he was alone, hiding the evidence of his rebellion in cracks and crevices throughout the basement. The papyrus fragments accumulated, dozens of them, then hundreds. A complete testimony of Athenian slavery, written by a man who'd lived every horror he described. But wait, it gets worse. There was another slave in Alexios's household, a young Syrian named Damon who worked as a kitchen servant. He was 19, recently purchased, still adjusting to his bondage. Unlike Phocion, he hadn't been broken yet. He still had fight in him, still believed escape might be possible. Damon had noticed Phocion's nocturnal activities. He'd seen the older slave writing in secret, hiding papers in the walls. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He waited until Phocion was asleep, then searched the basement room. He found the papyrus fragments, hundreds of them, covered in a script he couldn't read. But he understood what they represented, evidence of something, a secret worth discovering. Damon made a calculation. He was young, strong, and desperate for any advantage that might improve his situation. Reporting a rebellious slave to the master could earn him privileges, maybe even manumission eventually. It was a chance to rise at someone else's expense. The next morning, he went to Alexios. Alexios examined the papyrus fragments with growing fury. He couldn't read the language either, but he recognized his own name in several passages, written in Greek alongside the foreign script. He understood immediately that Phocion had been documenting crimes, preserving evidence, creating a record that could potentially threaten him. "How long has this been going on?" Alexios demanded. "I don't know, master. I only discovered it last night." Alexios called for Phocion. The old slave came limping up from the basement, his twisted feet barely supporting him, his arthritic hands trembling. When he saw the papyrus fragments spread across Alexios's desk, he knew it was over. "What is this?" Alexios held up one of the documents. "What language is this?" "My language. From my home." "And what have you written here? What lies and slander have you been spreading?" Phocion looked at his master, at the man-child he'd taught, who tortured him for entertainment, who'd forced him to write laws that destroyed thousands of lives. He felt nothing. No fear, no anger, just a vast emptiness. "The truth. I wrote the truth." Alexios struck him across the face, hard enough to knock the old slave to the floor. Phocion's twisted feet gave out, and he sprawled on the tiles, unable to rise. "The truth?" Alexios kicked him in the ribs. "You don't know truth. You're a slave. You're property. Property doesn't have truth. It has function." He ordered the guards to drag Phocion to the storage room, the same place where he'd been whipped years earlier. They chained him again, wrists above his head, feet barely touching the ground. But Alexios didn't bring the whip this time. He brought fire. "You like writing so much," Alexios said, heating an iron rod in a brazier. "Let's make sure you never write again." He pressed the glowing metal against Phocion's right hand, holding it there while the slave's palm blistered and burned. The smell of cooking flesh filled the room. Phocion screamed, unable to stop himself, the pain overwhelming every defense he'd built over 30 years. Alexios burned both hands methodically, destroying the tendons and nerves, ensuring that Phocion would never be able to hold a stylus or grip a pen again. When he finished, the slave's hands were ruined lumps of charred meat and exposed bone. "Now you're useless to me," Alexios said. "Can't write, can't teach, can't serve any function except dying slowly." He left Phocion hanging there for 3 days. No food, no water, no medical treatment for the burns. The old slave drifted in and out of consciousness, his destroyed hands throbbing with infection, his body shutting down from dehydration and shock. On the 3rd day, Alexios returned with a merchant, a contractor who supplied laborers to the silver mines at Lorient. "He's old and damaged," Alexios said, "but he can still carry rocks. I'll sell him cheap." The contractor examined Phocion with professional disinterest. "His hands are ruined, his feet are crippled. He'll last maybe 2 weeks underground before his body gives out. Then you'll get 2 weeks of work from him, better than nothing." They agreed on a price, 10 drachmas, less than Callias had paid for him 30 years earlier, less than the cost of a good pair of sandals. Phocion was cut down from the chains and dragged to a cart. Other slaves were already there, all destined for the mines, all dead men who just hadn't stopped breathing yet. As they loaded him into the cart, Phocion saw Damon watching from the doorway, the young Syrian who'd betrayed him for a chance at favor. Their eyes met for a moment. Damon looked away first. The cart pulled away from Alexios's house. Phocion never saw Athens again. The silver mines at Lorient were located about 30 miles from Athens, a complex of underground tunnels where the city-state extracted the wealth that funded its democracy, its philosophy, its art, and its endless wars. Thousands of slaves worked there at any given time, most of them dying within a year of arrival. The mines operated on a simple principle: extract maximum value from human bodies before they broke. No wasted motion, no unnecessary care, no consideration for anything except productivity. Slaves who couldn't work were left to die in the tunnels, their bodies dragged out when they began to stink too badly. Phocion arrived with a transport of 20 other slaves. Half were criminals sentenced to hard labor. The rest were slaves like him, deemed no longer useful for household work, sold to the mines as a final extraction of value before death. The overseer examined them briefly. You'll work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. You'll dig, carry, and load silver ore. You'll be fed once a day, enough to keep you working. You'll sleep in the barracks. If you try to escape, you'll be crucified at the mine entrance where everyone can watch you die. Questions? No one spoke. There was nothing to ask. They all understood. This was death, just spread out over weeks or months instead of arriving all at once. They sent Phocion to the deepest tunnels, where the newest veins of silver were being excavated. The shaft descended over 300 feet into the earth, a vertical climb down wooden ladders that Phocion's twisted feet could barely navigate. It took him an hour to reach the bottom, his ruined hands unable to grip properly, his legs shaking with the effort. At the bottom was hell. The tunnels were barely 3 feet high in most places, forcing the slaves to work on their knees or stomachs. The air was thick with rock dust that coated lungs and throat, making every breath an exercise in suffocation. Oil lamps provided the only light, casting shadows that made the space feel even smaller and more oppressive. Phocion's job was simple: load ore into baskets that other slaves would carry to the surface. He used a small pickaxe to break apart chunks of rock, then transferred them to the basket using his burned, barely functional hands. The work was agonizing. Every movement sent waves of pain through his damaged hands and feet. The dust invaded his lungs, triggering coughing fits that left him gasping. After the first 12-hour shift, he could barely crawl to the surface. His hands were bleeding, the burned skin splitting open from the labor. His lungs felt like they were filled with ground glass. His feet had swollen to twice their normal size from the climbing and standing. But wait, it gets worse. The barracks were long, low buildings packed with hundreds of slaves. They slept on bare boards, no blankets, no privacy. The food was a thin gruel made from barley and water, barely enough calories to sustain the brutal labor. Phocion was too exhausted to eat most nights. He'd collapse on the boards and drift into unconsciousness that wasn't quite sleep. The other slaves avoided him. Phocion's education, his intelligence, his decades of comparative privilege as a pedagogue, all of it was worthless here, worse than worthless. The manual laborers resented educated slaves, seeing them as collaborators who'd served masters willingly while they'd been worked to death in fields and workshops. One night, a large Thracian slave cornered him in the barracks. "I heard about you. You're the one who wrote speeches for politicians, the one who helped make laws about slaves." Phocion didn't respond. There was nothing to say. "My brother was a household slave. They sent him here because of a new law. Something about educated slaves being disposable. He died 6 months ago, coughing blood, his lungs destroyed. Did you write that law?" "I wrote the arguments that supported it." The Thracian punched him, hard enough to crack teeth. Phocion sprawled on the boards, blood filling his mouth. Other slaves gathered, watching with cold satisfaction as the Thracian kicked him repeatedly. "You deserve this," the Thracian said. "You deserve every fucking second of this." The beating continued until Phocion lost consciousness. When he woke, it was time for another shift. He dragged himself to the mine entrance, descended into the darkness, and resumed working with broken ribs and a face so swollen he could barely see. The weeks blurred together: work, collapse, sleep, work again. Phocion's body deteriorated rapidly. The rock dust accumulated in his lungs, making breathing increasingly difficult. His hands became infected, the burned flesh turning gangrenous. His feet, already ruined, lost all feeling. the nerves finally dying after decades of abuse. He lasted 6 weeks, not 2, as the contractor had estimated. 6 weeks of pure suffering, 6 weeks of his body slowly shutting down in the darkness. On his final shift, Foshan was deep in the tunnels, loading ore with hands that no longer worked properly. His vision was blurry, his lungs rattling with every breath. He knew he was dying. He could feel it, a coldness spreading through his body despite the heat of the mine. He stopped working and sat back against the tunnel wall, his pickaxe falling from his useless hands. Around him, other slaves continued their labor, too focused on survival to notice one more dying man. Foshan thought about his life. 30 years as a slave. 3 decades of serving the glory of Greece. He'd educated future citizens, written speeches that shaped policy, crafted arguments that advanced civilization. And it had all been built on his destruction, on the destruction of thousands like him. The greatest lie of Athens, the lie embedded in every philosophical text and political speech, was that slavery was natural, that some people were born to serve, that their bondage was justified by nature or the gods or some fundamental difference in souls. But Foshan knew the truth. There was no natural slave. There were only people with power and people without it. Athens had the power, so Athens wrote the philosophy justifying its cruelty. And slaves like him helped, writing the words that made brutality sound like wisdom. He'd been complicit in his own destruction. That was the final horror. He'd survived by serving, and his service had made slavery stronger, more entrenched, more philosophically justified. Every speech he'd written, every argument he'd crafted, had helped build the cage that held him. His breathing was becoming shallow, the coldness was spreading. Foshan closed his eyes and waited for the end. It came slowly, his lungs filled with fluid, drowning him from the inside. He drowned in darkness, 300 feet underground, surrounded by the wealth he'd helped extract for a city that had destroyed him. When the other slaves noticed he was dead, they dragged his body to a collection point. The mine operators kept a pile of corpses near the surface, waiting until there were enough to justify the effort of disposal. Foshan's body was thrown onto the pile, one more broken slave among hundreds. After 3 days, when the stench became overwhelming, they loaded the bodies onto a cart and took them to a mass grave outside the mining complex. Hundreds of slaves were buried there, their bodies tossed into pits without ceremony or marker. No names, no records, no acknowledgement that they'd ever existed. Foshan's body landed on top of others, his ruined feet tangled with someone else's legs, his burned hands clutching at nothing. They covered the pit with dirt and lime, leaving the dead to rot together in an anonymous mass. But the disposal process had been rushed. The lime wasn't properly distributed, and the grave was too shallow. Within weeks, the bodies began to decompose rapidly in the Greek heat. Gases built up in the pit, and the ground began to swell. 1 month after Foshan's burial, the mass grave exploded. The buildup of decomposition gases ruptured the earth, sending rotted body parts and putrid fluids across the area. Pieces of Foshan, along with dozens of other slaves, scattered across the ground around Lorien. Dogs came to feed. Vultures circled overhead. The mine operators eventually cleaned up the mess, burning the scattered remains and reburying them deeper. But for days, the air around the silver mines smelled of death and decay, a stench so powerful that workers at the surface complained they couldn't eat. The philosopher-slave who'd written speeches about virtue and justice ended up as dog food outside a mine. His body literally exploded from the grave, scattered and consumed by scavengers. The papyrus fragments he'd written, the documentation of 30 years of suffering, were never found. Alexios burned them all, destroying the only evidence of Foshan's truth. The slave's name appears nowhere in Athenian records. His story exists only in the gaps between the official history, in the silences of the texts that praise Athens's glory. The silver he helped mine funded the Parthenon, paid for the philosophers who wrote about natural slavery, and supported the democracy that debated freedom while enslaving tens of thousands. The words he wrote justified a system that killed him. The speeches he crafted were quoted for generations, attributed to Alexios and other masters, while Phocion rotted in an unmarked grave. This was Athens. This was the glory of Greece, built on the broken backs of men like Phocion, who were mutilated, tortured, and worked to death so that free men could philosophize about the good life. The city that gave the world democracy, philosophy, and theater did so by grinding human beings into dust and calling it natural order. Phocion served in silence. He taught, wrote, and suffered without complaint, believing that survival was victory enough. But survival wasn't victory. It was just prolonged death. And in the end, he didn't even get the dignity of a grave that would hold his body. The slave who educated Athens exploded from the earth, consumed by dogs, his genius and suffering alike forgotten. That's the truth they don't teach in history classes. That's the foundation of Western civilization, rotting in a pit outside a silver mine, feeding scavengers. Glory built on bones, philosophy written with slaves' blood, democracy funded by bodies worked to death in darkness. That was Greece. That was the price of its immortal legacy. And no one remembers the name of the man who paid it.